This is Buyer Persona Research 101. It's understanding what's going on in their world in their own words. So in other words, let's say you're on the technology side of infrastructure and you decide for the size of company that you target that you're looking for like a VP of digital infrastructure and a director of network operations or something. Hi, it's Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute. And I'm thrilled to welcome you to this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. If this is your first time joining us, welcome. We're thrilled to have you with us. Be sure to leave in the comments. Let us know where you're joining us from and what you do in the data center industry. If you're a frequent flyer, if you're joining us for the second or third time or more, we're thrilled to have you joining us again back. And each week I tackle a handful of the biggest sales and marketing challenges that we're hearing about from all over the data center ecosystem, regardless of whether you're with a data center operator like a hyperscale or colocation or edge or modular or wholesale data center provider, or perhaps you work for some kind of technology or facilities related company in and around data centers, digital infrastructure, or critical facilities. Or maybe you do something related to construction or real estate or investment, all of the capital that's responsible for powering all of this growth in data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities. Or maybe you and your team do something related to outsourced sales and marketing in and around the data center ecosystem. But regardless of what your role is, if you're looking to elevate what you do, what your team's impact is, what your company's impact is, you're in the right place. Regardless of what your role is on the go-to-market team. Perhaps you work in sales, like as an account executive, or a sales development or business development rep, like an AE or an SDR or a BDR. Or maybe you work in post-sales, like as an account manager or client success or CSM or AM or whatever refer to that within your own company. Or maybe you do something related to marketing or events or PR, or perhaps you work in product or innovation or channel partnerships if your company has both a direct and an indirect model. Or maybe you're the executive sponsor, the leader, the orchestra conductor, the aligner in chief, who's responsible for recruiting, building the amazing team that your company needs to get from point A to point B to support growth in the data center ecosystem. If you want to stay in the loop about upcoming educational events and resources just like this, make sure that you're subscribed to our data center sales and marketing newsletter. You can do so directly on our website at www.dcsmi.com. That way you get notified each Sunday direct to your email inbox of everything that's going on in the coming week or weeks. So what is on the agenda for today? First, we're going to start by looking at how a data center infrastructure business development leader can find time to contact new customers. How a data center infrastructure business development leader can find the time to contact new customers. After that, we'll talk about how a data center facilities, technology, and infrastructure consulting firm can identify its leads. After that, we'll discuss how a data center analytics provider over in the software, the technology part of the data center ecosystem, how a data center analytics provider can develop fresh content. Then we'll take a real quick break for a message from our sponsor. And in the second half of this week's data center go-to-market sales and marketing Q&A show, we'll talk about how to accelerate modular data center sales cycles with scalable solutions. So this is especially for modular data centers, builders, construction companies that provide modular data centers, how to accelerate those modular data center sales cycles with scalable solutions. After that, we'll look at how to close sales for advanced data center simulations and immersive experiences. That whole idea of like digital twins. We talk about that quite often on the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast. And then as we head down the home stretch for the final topic that we'll be looking at for this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, we'll look at how oil and gas companies raise capital for data center development projects over in the energy part of the data center ecosystem within facilities. So how oil and gas companies can raise capital for data center development projects. If you have an idea for a topic, a challenge, a question that you and your team are currently facing that you'd like us to consider addressing in an upcoming show, make sure to leave that in the comments wherever you're tuning in from, wherever you enjoy watching. So without any further delay, let's jump right into this week's first question. How does a data center infrastructure business development leader find the time to contact new customers? How does a business development leader for a data center infrastructure company find the time to contact new customers? That is a terrific question, and there's a couple subtle nuances of it that I want to peel back on right away. For starters, when someone who is a business development leader talks about contacting new customers, we first need to unravel whether you're talking about new potential customers or new actual customers, whether it's pre-sales or whether it is post-sales. So more than likely, the business development is usually on the pre-sales side. Usually the business development rep, the sales development rep, the account executive are all working on lead generation, sales cycle acceleration, creating new deals, advancing deals throughout your pipeline. So usually business development leaders are focused on contacting new potential customers. And a company that's in data center infrastructure, that's an interesting category as well, because for technology related companies, infrastructure might be considered like telecommunications and cabling and connectivity and the power, like distribution that happens within the facility. For data center facilities companies, for construction related companies, the word infrastructure has a different connotation. That's like power, utility grid power, like water coming into the facility, everything that makes all of that possible, with wrangling with grid supplies and getting hookups and everything to fuel all of that. So depending on what part of the data center ecosystem you work within, whether you're from the orientation of like a technology company or a construction real estate company, infrastructure can actually mean two different things. Technologists work on infrastructure projects, as do like people in the MEP and the construction side, the commissioning side of data centers. So regardless of which part of that you're working within, it's really just going to be a different way of how you define your ideal client profile, how you build your target account list, and how you identify your target buyer personas, the most important kind of stakeholders that you want to create awareness with, that you'll need to educate and build trust with. It's like if you work on the facilities or construction part of infrastructure, more than likely the kind of stakeholders that you're going to be looking to build relationships with are heads of construction for big hyperscalers or operators, or executives from contracting companies, perhaps site planners, perhaps data center designers, like architecture kind of firms, if you're working on facilities and construction related projects. If you work on infrastructure, like in the technology part of the data center ecosystem, then it's technologists that you're trying to build these relationships with. And depending on the size of an enterprise data center or the size of a data center operator, in smaller companies, you're probably looking to build relationships with like the CTO or the CIO. In mid-sized to large companies, maybe you're looking to build relationships with infrastructure engineers, operations, cybersecurity, telecommunications, data center managers. Again, the job roles will be specific not only to what your business model is, whether you're working with construction and facilities type of infrastructure, or whether you're working with technology infrastructure inside of an up and running already data center. It'll be different stakeholders, and then the stakeholders will even vary depending on not only the nature of your business model, but how big or small your target clients are. Typically, when you're defining your ideal client profile, you'll flesh out geographically where your ideal clients are located. For sure, when it comes to infrastructure, that's going to have an impact, because to be able to deliver, to be able to install, to be able to service infrastructure, you need to have a physical presence usually near that particular facility where the infrastructure is going. Size is a big issue as well. Like when it comes to your offerings for data center infrastructure, regardless of whether you're on the construction or facility side, or whether you're on the technology side, like how big does a company need to be to afford your minimums? And at what point is the company so large that they may not be a good fit for you? Your offering may not be able to deliver what they need based on like compliance or certification requirements or financial requirements or length of sales cycle or integration requirements or having certain resources, certain headcount in various places. But yeah, once you figure out where you do best geographically, how big or small your companies are, maybe there's some industries that are a better fit than others. That will help you to zero in on who you should be contacting in the first place. Now, when I hear business development and I hear contacting, that sounds a lot like outbound. That sounds a lot like outreach. And that's all well and good. But it's important when we talk about outbound prospecting to recognize that most of your buyers, regardless of whether you're working in the facilities construction side of infrastructure or the technology side of infrastructure, most of your buyers are way more sales allergic than they were 10 years ago. If we were talking about this 10 years ago, it was quite common to find that your typical buyer would get about halfway through their research and decision-making process, and then they'd be ready to talk to someone on your team in a sales capacity. At the time, CEB, the corporate executive board that got acquired by Gartner a couple of years back, they found about 56% of a typical buyer's journey was over before sales contact, which wasn't too bad, right? If you do things right, you were still in there for the final 44% of the sales cycle of their buyer's journey. Add in 10 years of digital transformation, millions of baby boomers retiring, more Gen Z and millennials in decision-making roles, and tens of millions of people working from home at the start of the 2020s, that 56% number has jumped all the way to 83%. Gartner found most recently that 83% of a typical buyer's journey, researching, comparing options, and evaluating pricing, now happens without you in the room. They're going to get 83%. They're going to only want to talk to you for the final best case scenario, you're only in there for the final 17%. And wow, does that change the nature of your whole go-to-market approach, your whole sales and marketing approach? So what that means is in order for a biz dev leader, in order for a biz dev team to get in early and often with the right people in the right places at the right time and in the right context, you can't show up anymore looking like you're doing outbound prospecting. You can't show up with sales breath. You can't show up with business development on your title, on the business card and your email signature and your LinkedIn profile and expect you to get a warm reception. It's just not going to happen anymore. However, most of the prioritized buyer personas for your kinds of business do need to learn. They're spending a lot of time on learning and development, professional development, workforce skills development, cross-training, retraining, upskilling. And to the extent that you're able to insert yourself into that process, so your business development team are seen more like teachers, consultants, subject matter experts, trusted advisors, maybe even thought leaders, you will get a welcome reception if you're tuned into what they care about most. This is buyer persona research 101. It's understanding what's going on in their world in their own words. So in other words, let's say you're on the technology side of infrastructure and you decide for the size of company that you target that you're looking for like a VP of digital infrastructure and a director of network operations or something, whatever the titles are. Once you figure out where you've done best and who's been most influential on your decision committees in previous contexts, you need to figure out among the consensus of that segment what they care about most, what they're trying to achieve professionally, both individually, as a team, as a company, in their own words, and what they're struggling with the most. What are their biggest challenges in their own words? And when you get the consensus on that, it's way easier to build a website, to build email marketing, to build event marketing, to build social media ads, outbound, whatever you're doing, to be a lot more empathetic, a lot more focused on what they care about. So before you worry about finding time to contact new customers, before you worry about revving up the engine on your outbound prospecting, take the time to do your homework and figure out what the heck they actually care about. What's going to cause them to, despite the fact that they're being bombarded by hundreds of interruptions a day, or at least hundreds of interruptions a week, for them to stop and take notice and be like, whoa, that's really interesting. Like digital infrastructure mistakes that mid-market infrastructure executives are making at financial services companies in Western Europe or the Midwestern United States or in Singapore, wherever you're located in, the more specific your offer is in your outbound, regardless of what the nature of this lead gen is, if it's trying to get them to download something, register for something, attend something, their language, their biggest goals, their biggest challenges is the only thing that's going to help you cut through the noise anymore. And you can't guess about that. You actually need to do the homework and figure out what's top of mind for them and figure out who on your team has the expertise to be able to share useful best practices and tips and advice that will help that kind of person understand the steps they need to take to close the gap on achieving their goals, or the steps they need to take to address this frustration, this challenge that is driving them nuts. And the better job you do with that early and often, and the often is a big deal as well. A typical buyer may have 25 to 30 touch points between complete stranger and purchase decision. The more often you show up and continue to add value to their professional development, their learning and development process, the more likely it is that they want to keep showing up and spending time with you. And even more importantly, they start to bring their coworkers with them. They start to be receptive to like, hey, who else should read this? Who else should watch this? Who else should attend this? And you start to notice that, that's pretty interesting. In the last 30 minutes, in the last 90 minutes, 6 people from the same company downloaded our guide, registered for our webinar, signed up to come to our breakfast seminar, our lunch and learn series, whatever it is. That's really interesting. They're talking about us. We can get multiple people from the same company coming and learning with us. We start to educate and build trust and drive alignment in the formative stages of the buyer's journey. So when it comes time to figuring out how a biz dev leader can find time to contact new customers, let's first make sure we're contacting these new potential customers with something that's in it for them, because you'll have a much higher success rate of getting them to pay attention and convert to a lead and continuing to engage and allowing you to educate and build trust with them. And that's the name of the game with all of this, is the outbound prospecting playbook from 10 years ago is dead. You might find severe edge cases in the low single digits that are still influenced by trade publications in print on paper, and that may still get motivated by direct mail or an offline event or something like that. But the reality is, the whole goal with your outbound prospecting is to get the right person from the right kind of company to take notice of some cool resource that you've put together, an educational resource or educational event that helps them do their job better, that helps their team perform better, that helps their company with something. Sure, socializing with people, taking them out for drinks, inviting them to a party, inviting them to a ball game, inviting them to a golf tournament, that's fun. In theory, it's building your brand, but is it really educating and building trust? The name of the game with all of this is business development needs to be part of the education and trust building department in your company, the multidisciplinary effort that starts at your C-level that says, we're tired of being marginalized. We're tired of the industry treating us like crap. We're tired of our prospects and customers taking us for granted and haggling and causing all kinds of problems. We're better than that. We have some of the smartest people on the planet. It's time we let the world know that in our category of data center infrastructure, that we have amazingly helpful insights, and we're going to make it a goal over the next 12 months to let the right people in the right companies know about this and continually engage them with that in a way that's going to be a game changer for us, getting on these short lists, staying on these short lists, and being able to close sales without compromise in the right context, so that these new customers see us as the definitive go-to experts in our category on the planet. So we get out of the vendor box, we get out of the commodity broker status, and we have true meaningful differentiation throughout the full buyer's journey. So that's how a data center infrastructure business development leader can find time to contact new customers. It's a lot of looking at what you're currently doing and being self-aware about, that worked 10 years ago, but is it still working today? Does it really align with how modern buyers are making these decisions and researching and comparing options and evaluating pricing in a self-driven buyer's journey? Again, Multidisciplinary. It takes a village. It's going to take your whole go-to-market team. It's not something that biz dev can do on their own. But this is what a data center infrastructure business development leader should be thinking about when it comes to finding time to contact new customers. Okay, what do we got up next? How does a data center facilities, technology, and infrastructure consulting firm identify leads? How does a data center facilities, technology, and infrastructure consulting firm identify leads? So your company is in the professional services business as a consultancy, and you have expertise throughout many parts of the data center ecosystem. Facilities, there's about 13 different business models that we track in and around the sector of the data center infrastructure, data center facilities part of the data center ecosystem. There's 22 different kinds of data center technology companies that we catalog. So that alone, facilities and technology, is about 36 different kinds of business models that you would potentially need to have expertise around. And infrastructure can actually overlay. There's facilities related infrastructure and there's technology related infrastructure. So how does a consulting firm like yours that has deep expertise across potentially dozens of different areas that span data center facilities and technology identify leads? What it largely comes down to is, as long as your company is well established and you have product market fit and go to market fit, you likely know exactly who your ideal clients are. You know what productized services or services that they purchase from your firm. You know roughly what they pay for those. You know what the sales cycle length is. You know how frequent they repurchase. You know basically all of the unit economics, like average client lifetime value, cost of acquisition, LTV, client acquisition costs, CAC, sometimes known as cost of client acquisition, COCA, you know, your profit margins, you know, your average sales cycle length, because when you have the muscle memory, when you have that pattern recognition, you're able to know these things for sure. If you have a new firm, then a lot of what you're doing in your first 6, 12, 18 months in business is you're running a lot of go-to-market experiments to figure out exactly where that sweet spot is. So once you know the answers to those, you have product market fit. Once you've evolved beyond founder-led sales and you have multiple sales professionals like sales development reps, business development reps, account executives that have successfully sold these engagements, and they've met quota, exceeded quota for multiple quarters in a row, you have go-to-market fit. So you have a strong degree of confidence that as your company infuses more capital into your growth engine, that you're going to continue to get results and you'll have predictable outcomes by continuing to hire marketers and sales developers and account executives and account managers that help to scale the growth of your consultancy. And then there's also channel partner market fit that comes up in parts of the data center ecosystem as well. That's where you start to work with like integrators and managed service providers and master agents and manufacturers reps and things like that, that basically become an extension of your marketing, sales, and services team, but they get paid on a performance only basis. They don't work for your company full time. They may have 10 or 20 different relationships with firms like yours, but it's a way to get to a lot of nooks and crannies and small niches that may not be practical for your existing company. So that's the direct versus indirect kind of model. But so once you have go-to-market fit, once you have product market fit, you know what kind of lead you largely want. So that should drive being able to have a concise, crisp, one-page ideal client profile. So you know geographically where these clients are located. Can you really effectively serve data center facilities, technology, and infrastructure consulting clients all over the planet? Or are you best suited working on one particular continent or one particular country or a couple of countries or particular geographic areas? So first, get realistic about where you've had success and where you think you'll continue to have success, because there definitely are physical presence, there are definitely physical location, geographic issues that come up in many of those dozens of areas within technology and facilities in and around the data center ecosystem. So can you realistically market, sell, and service these consulting services all over the planet, or are you narrowing it down? Second, what size company is a really good fit for your firm? How big do they need to be to afford your minimums? Do they need to have at least 50 employees? Do they need to have at least 200 employees, 500 employees? Again, you'll know what your minimums are and what kind of company can typically afford it. You may be used to thinking in terms of like kilowatts, megawatts, square footage, square meters. The reality is at some point when it comes to lead generation, lead qualification, go to market, you'll need to normalize and standardize that based on headcount, based on estimated number of employees. And at the other side, at the other extreme, the bottom end of the range for the minimum number of employees, what's the maximum number of employees? At what point does a company get so large that it just would be really unwieldy for you to be able to have that company as a consulting client? I don't know, maybe your company is big enough or you have something unique enough that you really can sell these kind of consulting services to Fortune 500 companies. But for a lot of smaller consulting firms, it's highly likely that the curveballs, the political landscape, the compliance requirements, legal requirements, integration requirements, headcount requirements, there's a host of issues, sales cycle length, cost of carrying receivables, whatever it is, that could completely overwhelm a smaller firm. So be realistic on the upper end of the range for a lot of consulting firms in this category. Maybe your client needs to have maybe a minimum of 50 employees up to 5,000 employees or 1,000 employees or something like that. Again, your mileage will vary depending on where you're located, your company size, the nature of your business model, and who you target. But for sure, when it comes to identifying qualified leads, when it comes to lead generation, we definitely need to get really clear on geography and company size. We also likely want to get clear on industries. Are there certain industries that have proven to be a really good fit for what you do with your consulting services across data center tech, facilities, and infrastructure? And are there certain industries that have been a really bad fit where you've struggled and would prefer not to work with them in the future for various reasons? So again, that's important for lead gen and lead qualification, because oftentimes you'll build out separate website pages and have certain information on your homepage that's unique to each kind of industry, each kind of stakeholder within those industries. It's very common for that kind of segmentation to show up on your website navigation and top and bottom navigation kind of menus. Very common for the forms, your lead generation forms on your website, to take into account which of the following best describes you, what industry do you work in, being able to capture that information so you can properly segment and personalize. That you'll almost certainly want to use filters or lists in your CRM and your customer relationship management system. And increasingly, we're seeing throughout the data center ecosystem that a lot of leadership teams are specializing sales and marketing for various industry segments and sometimes even for company sizes. Like, again, I don't know the context of how big or small your consulting firm is, but it's entirely possible. Let's say, for example, you have deep expertise in healthcare and financial services, and you want to have all of your growth going forward in those two verticals. It's very likely that you would hire a team, or at least hire one or two account executives or account managers with deep expertise in healthcare, and different people with deep expertise in financial services, and have them, and of course, consulting experts who are going to deliver your professional services, your account managers and client success and the actual consultants that have deep expertise in that area. And that changes the nature of what you do with your, how you segment into your buyer personas, the job roles and the kinds of companies, the goals, the unique goals and challenges that each kind of stakeholder has, whether they're in healthcare or financial services, basically the bullet points that show up in their goals and challenges, and what you do with that information to drive your website copywriting, your sales enablement, your email marketing, your event marketing, basically everything that has to do with lead generation, lead nurturing, sales acceleration, and turning some of these folks into deals on your deals board and some of them actually closing into new clients. So at the end of the day, to identify leads for a company specializing in data center facilities consulting, data center technology consulting, data center infrastructure consulting, there's a lot to be said for going back to the basics. Make sure that your ideal client profile is crystal clear, geographically, where they're located, how big or small their companies are, industries that are especially good fit for you, industries that are especially bad fit. That will drive being able to build a target account list of named accounts of who you want to go after. These are basically anywhere from a couple dozen, usually a couple hundred, sometimes a couple thousand companies that fit that ideal client profile that basically defines your addressable market. In a lot of cases, you'll take that list and carve it up and give it to different people on your team to be able to have those named accounts that they're going to be working over the next several weeks, over the next several months, to try to generate leads and have deals progress to various stages of maturity on your deals board and in your sales pipeline. And once you have defined at the company level in your ideal client profile and your target account list, then it's basically the leads are usually individual kinds of people within those companies. And again, depending on the nature of how big or small your company is, how big or small their company is, you'll ultimately be able to figure out by looking at like your case studies, looking at your testimonials, your reviews, looking at your CRM system. You'll be able to figure out who the stakeholders are that have had the biggest say, both pre-sales and post-sales, and what they ultimately ended up choosing for this kind of consulting engagement. When you know that, you'll be able to typically designate who your most important segment is, your primary buyer persona, who your second most important segment is, your secondary buyer persona. In larger accounts, maybe there's a tertiary. There could be even 4 different kinds of buyer personas. And then with each of those segments, we need to do our homework. We need to figure out what is going on in their world that we can potentially help them with. If you have a product manager, they spend a ton of time figuring this out. If you don't have a product manager and you happen to wear the hat of product manager, essentially what we need to do is, whether it's face-to-face interviews, video interviews, calls, surveys, studying their search and social footprint, studying stuff you see in the CRM, we need to get the consensus in their own words on what's going on in their world, their biggest goals and their biggest challenges, segment by segment, because that's going to drive everything that we want to do with creating lead generation offers, with creating lead nurturing offers, everything that we're doing, and your lead qualification criteria. But we need to know why they should pay attention to your company in the first place. And the better job we can do of getting tuned into what's going on in their world, the more likely it is that we can show up with the landing page, the email marketing, the event marketing that really, really resonates with what's going on in their world. So that's a huge, huge part of being able to identify the leads, is knowing who they are, knowing what they care about. Are we talking to the right person? And are we intercepting them early enough in their journey where we have a significant chance to impact how they evaluate all of the different options that are in front of them when it comes to consulting around data center facilities, technology, and infrastructure? So that's how I would approach lead identification. That's how I would approach how a data center facilities, technology, and infrastructure consulting firm can identify leads. Okay, what do we got up next? Next question. Okay, this one is software related, technology related within the data center ecosystem. How does a data center analytics provider develop fresh content? How does a data center analytics provider develop fresh content? That is a fantastic question, regardless of whether you consider your company traditional software or more software as a service, or maybe you offer both kinds of options. Maybe you hook into IoT, Internet of Things, with all kinds of sensors and monitors. I've actually had a number of people on the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast in recent weeks and recent months who work on either software or sensors or consulting around that would ultimately be able to have data analytics coming off of what's going on in a data center. So a lot of what this comes down to is, are you focusing on facilities related analytics? Are you focusing on technology related analytics, or both? The technology related analytics, you're typically going to want to create content that appeals to technologists, IT people, IT infrastructure, data center system engineers, data center managers. In other words, people that rack and stack and install servers and troubleshoot servers and replace hard drives and do cable pulls and routers and switches. That's on the technology side. Now, if your analytics provide value to facilities professionals, you typically are going to want to create this content aligned at facilities managers. And depending on the nature of how big or small these facilities are, whether they're end use data centers that associated with enterprises with end users, or whether they're data centers that are part of data center operators like colocation or hyperscale providers, will depend on who your analytics provides value for. So is it facilities managers? Is it engineers? Is it HVAC people? Is it electricians? Is it plumbers? And there's all different kinds of facilities related stakeholders. Security, physical security on the facility side, and there's cybersecurity on the technology side. So again, the nature of what your software does, what your analytics platform does, will depend a lot on how you identify and how you prioritize your buyer personas, which is where you should start with anything that you're doing with creating fresh content. And the interesting part with fresh content is the word fresh bears a little bit of digging into. I'm a huge believer for most companies, unless they have ridiculous amounts of resources, that most of your content investments should be reasonably evergreen, meaning that avoid staying away from current events issues because you'll get a little bit of a jump and then basically complete crickets. Nobody wants to consume that kind of content a couple days after it's dropped. And for a company with relatively modest reach, you may not have a big enough email list. You may not have a big enough social following. You may not have a big enough ad budget that you can really capitalize on something that's a flash in the pan, that's timely, and then disappears with demand to read that, watch that, consume that kind of content like mere days later. I think you're far better off in most cases really understanding who your prioritized buyer personas are when it comes to your analytics platform, who's the most important and second most important kind of stakeholder that you engage with, understanding the goals and challenges that are going on in each one of those people's worlds in their own words, and then use those goals and challenges in their own words to drive your content calendar, to drive your editorial calendar, to drive your events calendar of what you want to talk about. And it's not even a matter so much of what you want to talk about, is what they want to hear about, what your prioritized buyer personas have going on in their world, and how you can add value to their learning and development, their professional development, how you can expose them to insights that can help them do their job better, that can help their team, that can help their company. That's a very client-driven, client-centric way of approaching that. And in a self-driven buyer's journey where people are more sales allergic than they've ever been in the past, and you really need to work hard to earn your way in early and often, as a teacher, as a consultant, as a subject matter expert, as a trusted advisor, maybe even a thought leader, we need to get really, really zeroed on into what's going on in their world and how you and your internal subject matter experts can potentially help them achieve their goals that are a leading indicator, or solve their problems that are a leading indicator that at some point in the coming weeks or some point in the coming months, that they'd be a great prospect, a great potential client for your company's analytics software. So we need to understand that full journey, and we need to get in early and often, because in a self-driven world where people don't want to spend a lot of time with your sales team anymore, they're going to get almost to the point of purchase before you even know they exist. So what that means, it's not a good thing if you only talk to them at the end, because in those early and middle stages of the journey, they're learning from someone, and whoever they're learning from is going to stack the decks in their favor of their particular solution. So if you want to be able to intersect someone early enough so they spend a significant part of that awareness and consideration parts of the buyer's journey with you and members of your team, so that you stay on the short list. So you get on the short list, stay on the short list, and have a significant opportunity to shape the criteria that they use to evaluate all of the different options that are in your category. This is a long game. It's a marathon, not a sprint. And it's a recognition that we need to understand what are the leading indicators that someone is going to be in market for analytics software in the near future. And they're the right person, and we know exactly what they care about and how we can add value to their lives, and how we can add so much value that they're motivated to start to introduce you to other stakeholders from their company. Like, when someone downloads a guide and they get back an email that says, who else should be reading this? We know when it comes to analytics, it takes a village. There's typically people involved from infrastructure, engineering, operations, cybersecurity, whatever, on the technology side and infrastructure, and on the facility side of infrastructure, mechanical, electrical, plumbing, whatever, security, whatever is relevant to what your particular software does. With that in mind, hit the forward button and add a thought or two on why this matters. And regardless of whether they're circulating your downloadable guide or your webinar invitation or your lunch and learn invitation, the name of the game where there's multiple stakeholders involved is to have multiple stakeholders from the same company learning with your experts. And when that happens, magical things happen in your sales process. When you ignore that, magical things happen in your competitors' sales process, your direct competitors, your indirect competitors, even your non-business model competitors. Because remember, your prioritized buyer personas are learning somewhere. Do you want them to be learning from you, or do you want them to be learning from someone else that competes with you? At the end of the day, it's your decision. But that's how I would approach how a data center analytics provider can develop fresh content, is extreme empathy for who they are and what they care about, and recognition that for a self-driven buyer's journey where 83% happens before sales contact, we need to get in early and often. They don't want to spend a lot of time with account executives or sales development reps anymore, but they will spend time with consultants and teachers and trusted advisors and subject matter experts. So in other words, they need to perceive most of your go-to-market team to seem a lot more like Big Four consultants and a lot less like transaction-focused vendors. That's how we get you out of the vendor box. So that's the approach that not only develops fresh content, but fresh content and fresh events that motivates the right people in the right places at the right time to want to spend a significant amount of time learning from you and your client-facing team members. So they see that in your category of data center analytics, that you have some of the smartest people on the planet. That's how a data center analytics provider can develop and nurture and grow fresh content. So that brings us to just about the halfway point on this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. If you've been getting good value so far, make sure that you hit the like button, help spread the love, help spread the word to let others know about this event. So we'll take a real quick break for a message from our sponsor. When we come back, we'll tackle 3 more of the biggest go-to-market sales and marketing challenges going on in data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities. The Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, make sure that you subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website that can be found at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that URL is www.dcsmi.com. Hey there, it's Joshua Feinberg from DCSMI, the Data Center Sales and Marketing Institute, and you're tuned into this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, where each week I tackle a handful of the biggest sales and marketing challenges that we're hearing about all over the world in data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities, regardless of whether you are from a data center operator, technology or facilities company, construction, real estate or investment company, or some kind of outsourced sales and marketing company. If you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you think we should be addressing in an upcoming show, please add that in the comments wherever you're watching, and we'll add that to the consideration queue to potentially tackle in one of our upcoming episodes. So what do we have up next? Next question that we'll be tackling this week has to do with modular data centers. So what do we got? How do we accelerate modular data center sales cycles with scalable solutions? How do we accelerate modular data center sales cycles with scalable solutions? So that's a fantastic question. I know a really, really hot area right now, because with all of the grid capacity issues and density requirements that are now coming up with data center operators and end user data centers that are driven by AI and GPUs and high performance computing, the demand for modular data centers has been and continues to be quite robust. So I look at, when it comes to accelerating sales cycles and scalable solutions, there's really 2 different playbooks that most builders, most providers of modular data centers are going to operate within. There's a playbook, there's a long distance playbook, and there's a hyper-local playbook. And the challenge is, when it comes to a hyper-local playbook, for a colocation provider, you know what hyperlocal is, right? Like, let's say, for example, that you are a colocation provider and you operate in 6 different regions throughout 6 different cities throughout a particular country, or 6 different cities throughout a particular continent, or whatever it is. There's a playbook that you'll run long distance that relies on digital marketing and webinars and videos and things like that. And then there's a playbook that's hyperlocal, that's focused on getting people that are, say, within a 30 or 60-minute drive of your location to come and experience those same kind of educational events in person, with the idea that the more time that they spend with you in that context with your experts in your facility, and the more likely it is that they're going to take a tour and they're going to walk away from the tour at the end of the event with, be like completely wowed with, wow, I really learned a lot. They have some really smart, super nice, personable people. I love their facility. Yeah, for sure. when our contract is up for renewal, we're moving here without a doubt. So that's what you do. That's the hyperlocal approach. And then essentially, if they're long distance, you're trying to do that virtually, digitally. So with modular, it's different. With modular, you don't really know where you're going to do hyperlocal. You know how to do digital. It's going to be similar to how you would do digital if you were a colocation operator or hyperscale or edge. But you don't really know where to do your hyperlocal marketing for a modular data center provider. More than likely, it's going to be a function of where you have manufacturing capabilities, because modular data centers are pretty big. It's not as easy as like shipping a router or server or network attached storage array or something like that to a client. So more than likely, you're going to be limited to being able to sell modular data centers within a place where you can ship them by truck or boat, potentially, or train to a particular location, and have the ability to send your crew to be able to install and configure and customize and ultimately service that. So when it comes to your modular data center company, that's your basic ideal client profile. You're defining geographically where these clients tend to be located, whether it's a particular state or province or region or country or group of countries or something like that. And you're defining the sizes that are a good fit. When you get dialed into geographically where you can realistically market, sell, manufacture, install, and service these modular data centers, that will make it a little bit easier to decide how to do your hyperlocal marketing. And once you know that, you ultimately are going to need to make a decision with whether you're primarily going to do your offline marketing, your hyperlocal marketing, in your largest existing, in your regions where there already are big clusters of existing data center facilities. Again, just by knowing your market in your local area, you should know the areas where there's the highest concentration of data center facilities, right? So if that's the case, essentially what you're looking to do to replicate kind of the same kind of model that like a colocation operator would do is you transport one of your modular data centers to that region. You rent or barter space, whatever it is, for your facility to stay there and get connected to whatever utility services you need to successfully run that. And then you're going to run the same kind of playbook that a colocation facility would do, except you're doing it within the constraints of a modular data center construction company. So, ideally you want the modular data center to be adjacent to a property, adjacent to like a data center operator, whoever is kind of your host and your partner with all this, that has a decent sized conference room or a classroom or something like that, where you can host events on a pretty regular basis. And what do you do with these hosted events? You look at who your buyer personas are, and you look to host amazingly helpful educational events that allow these folks to come in. And whether it's a breakfast seminar or lunch and learn or something like that, you're addressing the biggest issues that CTOs of colocation operators or mid-market manufacturing companies or telecommunications companies, whatever it is, need to be thinking about when it comes to finding the right modular data center solution. So there's an educational component. Let's say, for example, this is a breakfast seminar, and whoever is hosting this event that's allowing you to park your modular data center on their property for a couple of days or a couple of weeks, however long you're doing this kind of campaign. Let's say their classroom holds 20 people. You invite, 2,000 people or 200 people, or whatever it is, the perfect fit, and you encourage them to register. They register, they come in, they have a little bit of mingling time and have some nice breakfast. They sit down, they have your experts within your company provide conference grade content that's so good that if they flew across the country, traveled, and spent a lot of time and money to attend this, that you're highly confident that you would have one of the best sessions at that particular event. That's always what I tell people when you're producing your own webinars or producing your own lunch and learns and breakfast seminars, is imagine that you went through the multi-step criteria for presenting this kind of topic or this information at a session. Would you pass through the initial application process based on the title and the abstract? Would your slides, your presentation, pass through the advisory council to say like, oh yeah, this topic, the speaker, we're really excited. The slides seem fantastic. We know they're going to deliver a lot of value. It's not going to be an infomercial. It's not going to be a nonstop sales pitch. For sure, the people that are attending this are going to learn a lot. And then the kind of third criteria when all of this with conference grade content is the room is set for 20 people at the beginning of the talk. All 20 people are still sitting there. They're not distracted. They're not looking down at their phone. They're actually highly engaged and learning a ton. And then, of course, in the surveys, whether they're paper surveys or mobile app surveys or whatever, that you're highly confident that you're going to get fantastic report cards from all the people that attended, that they learned a ton. They're glad they came. And next time around, they'll be thrilled to bring back multiple people from their company to continue learning. And in the course of doing that, immediately following the educational session, you take people on a tour through the modular data center that you have parked adjacent to their facility. So very similar to how you would approach this with being in the co-location business, except you need to basically find a host for where your modular data center is going to be stationed, or it's going to be parked where you can get hooked up to utility power. Ideally, someone that has a foyer, a classroom, or conference room where you can host these events over the course of while you're there with segment by segment. So let's say, for example, you have 3 different buyer personas. Again, maybe you're targeting CTOs of small to mid-sized co-location operators, CTOs of mid-sized manufacturing companies, and managed service providers. So say, for example, you're there for a week. You do one of these events on Tuesday, one of these events on Wednesday, one of these events on Thursday. You have 3 different groups of 15 or 20 people come in and learn from your founders, your CTOs, whoever is going to be speaking and teaching them some cool, useful stuff about what's going on. You give them the tour. You spend some time having breakfast and chatting with them, and you're building your pipeline. It's an amazingly impactful thing. And then lather, rinse, and repeat. You put the modular data center, hook it up to the truck, and you transport it to the next location. You repeat this in the next region the following week, and you do this over and over and over again. That's how you're doing offline marketing. And at the same time you're doing this, in a perfect world, have someone taking video of the session. So for everyone from that company, from the attendees companies that should have been there that wasn't there, there's a way for them to spread the content, repurpose this across your blog and your email and your social channels, and largely the same kind of content remotely, except remotely they're not going to get to walk through your modular data center. So that's how I would approach how a modular data center provider can accelerate sales cycles with scalable solutions: is get in early, get in often, make the information that you have so compelling and so valuable that they're motivated to want to spend time with you. And just recognize, when it comes to something as unique as modular data centers, unlike infrastructure as a service or co-location, where you could have a significant amount of your pipeline closing without ever seeing the facility, it's very unlikely you're going to do this with modular data centers. So the road show, taking your module around, parking it in places, potentially transporting, having hosts that can have your modular data center sitting on their property for a couple of days, a couple of weeks, a couple of months at the time, and cycling in and doing these events with all of your segments on a regular basis would be a huge, huge help on the hyperlocal. Also, aside from hosting your own events, you could potentially have co-marketed kind of events. Let's say, for example, in that third segment, we were talking about managed service providers. Maybe of the 20 managed service providers that are in the room, 3 or 4 of them want to each have a specially branded event for themselves. So you have 3 or 4 more events for each of those MSPs or each of those integrators or each of those consultancies, where they invite their list, you invite their list, you each invite their list. Each of you are responsible for filling up half of the room, and you're cross-pollinating. And it's a great co-marketing kind of opportunity to get in front of their end users. You could also potentially host meetups that are anchored to doing a tour of the modular data center, user group type meetings. These are all things that co-location providers, data center operators do on a very regular basis. Some bring in students from local high schools and local colleges, like in the context of an intern. Again, it's the sky's the limit for how creative you want to be. But if you really understand your ideal client profile and your targeted buyer personas, and understand the journey that someone goes through between awareness and consideration and decision for when it comes to modular data centers, it's about showing up in a way that we get out of the vendor box as quickly as possible, so that the people that are attending recognize that you have very, very deep expertise at the intersection of their business model, where they're located, their company size, and building, constructing, installing, and supporting modular data centers. So what do we have up next? So that's how I would approach how to accelerate modular data center sales cycles with scalable solutions: is understand the steps they go through in their journey, and get in early, get in often. Email marketing, event marketing. Number 2, you could potentially do a hybrid where they tour in person and your follow-up and your nurturing is happening by email marketing and webinars. Or the initial touch is webinars with the idea that someone attends 2 or 3 webinars and you're building up to like, hey, 2 months, 3 months, make sure that you register because we're going to be coming to town and you'll get a chance to experience one of our modular data centers firsthand. So there's a lot of different ways to approach this, but recognize that in a self-driven journey where people are more sales allergic than ever, we have to show up in a way where your buyer personas feel like they're interacting with their peers, not someone that's just trying to put them on a deals board that's trying to heavily qualify them and push them through a transaction. We got to be able to play the long game. So the acceleration is counterintuitive, but if we continue to provide value at each step of the way, so we're in there early, we're in there often, we're the kind of the Sherpa, the guide that's helping them to understand all the different steps and milestones that people like those particular job functions in that particular region and that a company roughly that size and that kind of industry would typically navigate when it comes to deciding what they're going to do for modular data centers. It tends to be a really good net win-win-win all around. So that's how I would approach accelerating modular data center sales cycles with scalable solutions. Okay, what do we have up next? How do we close sales for advanced data center simulations and immersive experiences? How do we close sales for advanced data center simulations and immersive experiences? It's interesting. About 10 years ago, I remember it was the first time someone approached me that was building what today would probably be considered AI software for designing data centers, like data center architects, before AI was really mainstream. Now, today, you see pretty much in every category, regardless of whether you're looking at the operator, the technology, or the facility side, or the construction, the real estate side. A lot of companies are developing simulation, digital twin kind of solutions to support what they do within the data center ecosystem for specific segments, for specific kinds of stakeholders. I've had conversations with people that are doing this within networking, internetworking, like cabling, connectivities, routers, and switches, firewalls. I've had people that have talked to me about what they're doing for simulations on the real estate guide in a way that would help like data center site selection experts figure out the best places to place data centers. And seen a number of companies that are working in the environmental monitoring part of it, or monitoring cooling and humidity and power in and around the facilities part of data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities. But regardless of who you're doing these advanced data center simulations and immersive experiences for, what closing sales comes down to is demonstrating value and earning your way in early and often. So once you understand your business model, once you've achieved product market fit, once you've achieved go-to-market fit, in other words, you know exactly who your ideal buyers are, what kind of software and services, customization and training they purchase from your firm, at what price points, how often they purchase, if there are subscriptions like monthly recurring, annual recurring, you know all of those. You for sure know all of your unit economics, like average client lifetime value, average cost of customer acquisition, sales cycle length, margins. And then as you've scaled your own sales team, your direct sales team, and perhaps your channel partner team, you understand you've gotten to the point where you can continue to deploy capital in your growth engine, and you know that the wheels aren't going to fall off because you know the process is really well documented as to how you're going to market with specific kinds of segments. And that's the key part with all of this. It's not just your business model, it's who you're targeting. And depending on the company sizes that you're targeting, that ultimately is a driver many times of the job titles and the job functions of who's going to be most interested in your simulation software and immersive experiences and modeling what they can expect, regardless of whether they're a technologist, a facilities expert, someone in construction, real estate. I haven't seen it go that deep yet, but I imagine on the financial side, on the investment side, capitals, private equity, venture, there's also quite a few people that are looking to model what they can expect on internal rate of return and payback periods and things like that with their portfolio companies that are potentially using these platforms. So how do we close sales? What it largely comes down to is knowing who these primary and secondary stakeholders are, your primary and secondary, maybe your tertiary buyer personas, and understand what's going on in their world. why would they want to consider purchasing your software for simulations, for digital twins, for immersive experiences? What's the job to be done that you're doing? For software companies, for sure, you have a product manager, right? Regardless of whether you call it a chief product officer, like a CPO, or a product manager, or a technical co-founder that wears that hat in a smaller company. Maybe you have a chief innovation officer. But at the end of the day, you're spending a significant amount of time visiting your clients, understanding the challenges and problems that are going on in their world, and trying to figure out how your software, how your simulations, how your immersive experiences help them make better decisions faster. When you understand that, then we're basically trying to back into building a buyer's journey, building a roadmap of how we anticipate what are the leading indicators that someone is going to be a great fit for the simulation and immersive experience software in the coming weeks and in the coming months. And once we understand who they are and the process that they would go through, that leads them to the natural conclusion that they'd be a prospect, that they'd be a sales opportunity on your deals board at some point in the coming weeks or in the coming months for your simulations and immersive experiences, then we can figure out what we need to do with lead generation and sales cycle acceleration. In other words, like, for example, let's say we're targeting technologists who are interested in connectivity, interconnection, routers, telecommunication kinds of issues that have to do with the simulations and immersive experiences. So maybe we have in a really small operator end user kind of scenario, maybe we'd like to get some face time with the CTO. More than likely, it's a like VP of digital infrastructure, or digital infrastructure engineer, or network operations, or telecommunications, or something like that. So we figure out who the 2 or 3 most important stakeholders are. We interview them face to face, or on video or phone, or we do some surveys. We look at the CRM, we study the breadcrumbs that they leave on search and social media, and we come up with a consensus in their own words, not what you think their words are, but what the words actually are, of what's going on in their life professionally. What's going on in their world? What are the biggest goals that they need to achieve individually, that their team is working on, that their company is working on, that are directly or indirectly related to the need for simulation software and immersive experiences? When we get the consensus on their biggest goals, then we shift gears to what's driving them nuts. What are their biggest challenges? What are their biggest struggles? Same basic exercise. We need to know in their own words. Once we do that for the primary buyer persona, once we do that for the secondary buyer persona, and any tertiary or third or fourth persona, third or fourth segment, then we can create our content, our editorial calendar, we can create our events calendar, and we can figure out a way that we're going to attract and engage and educate and build trust with those folks throughout their entire journey, not just at the end when they've gotten 83% of the way and they're ready for a sales conversation. If we do that, we're too late most of the time, because you're only in there for the final 17%. No, we need to be in there for the full journey. We need to be in there for 100% of the journey, so we have a chance to not only get on the short list, but stay on the short list and stack the decks in our favor by impacting the criteria that they use to evaluate all the different options that are in front of them for how they address those goals, how they address those challenges that are a leading indicator that they're going to be in market for simulation software and immersive experiences in the coming weeks and the coming months. And the better job we do with that, the more time they want to spend with your internal subject matter experts, the more likely it is that they start to bring their coworkers and bring their boss, basically the full decision committee, with them to the next event to continue learning from you, whether these are offline events, online events, webinars, whether these are downloadable resources, or all of the above. The goal is to get in early and often. Early is super important. Often is equally as important. The buyer for this is going to probably go through 25 to 30 touch points before they ultimately make a decision. And the more value they're getting from you, the more likely it is that they'll continue to show up. And the more likely it is that they'll feel like, okay, I'm not recommending that we buy this platform, but wow, this is a really helpful event. It's super targeted for who we are and what we're working on. Yeah, I'm going to hit the forward button. I'm going to share it on the Slack channel. I'm going to tell my 2, 3, 4 of my coworkers why they should come to this event along with me. We know the teams that learn together tend to grow together, and what you're proactively doing in a pre-sales context is you're driving alignment, which most of the time, the reason that deals go sideways on big enterprise deals is there hasn't been enough of this done while they were in learning mode. We want to be their company of choice, their destination of choice, that multiple stakeholders from the same company want to spend time with learning when it comes to anything and everything that's directly or indirectly related to your category. when it comes to simulation software and immersive experiences, regardless of whether your platform is focused on the needs of technologists or facilities experts or construction, architecture, investment experts, regardless of what it is. We need to make sure that we get in early and we get in often. We need to make sure that the most important stakeholders in these companies see you and your internal experts as teachers, as consultants, as trusted advisors, as subject matter experts, maybe even some people on your team may be seen as thought leaders. That's what lets them, their guard goes down and they start to be open a little more to your feedback and input. Whereas if you only meet them at the end, then their guard is way, way up. The skepticism, the cynicism, all that stuff comes up. And that's when you start to get messed up. And the thing is too, is like, if you don't get in early and you don't get often, recognize that these stakeholders are learning from someone. Do you want them to be learning from you and your team members, your colleagues, or do you want them to be learning from direct competitors, indirect competitors, non-business model competitors? Ultimately, the choice is yours. But if you understand the way the world is moving, where nearly all of the journey now happens without you in the room, the only way you're going to get back in the room is to show up as the experts, to show up as the teachers, to show up as the trusted advisors. That's the key unlock with all of this, to accelerate more of the right leads into opportunities and accelerate more of the right opportunities into new clients and retain clients, good onboarding, good initial intended value, extended value, expansion, cross-sell, upsell. All of that depends on educating and building trust. For many companies, this is going to be a massive culture change that needs to start at the top, with your CEO recognizing that we have some of the smartest developers and engineers on the planet when it comes to simulations and immersive experiences. We're tired of our prospects and customers treating our team members like crap. We're tired of the condescension. We're tired of the ghosting. We're tired of all this BS, not getting paid, being haggled, all this stuff. We're better than that. And it's time we let the world know why, early and often. So that's how to close sales for advanced data center simulations and immersive experiences. Is your sales team should look a lot more like consultants, teachers, and trusted advisors. So that brings us to our final question for this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. If you've been getting good value from this week's show, make sure that you help to spread the word, share some love, hit the like button on whatever platform that you're watching. And if you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you think we should address in an upcoming show, be sure to leave that in the comments wherever you're watching. Final question for this week has to do with energy. And that's a really, really good area to be looking at, because so much of what's happening right now globally with data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities is as a result of power grid energy availability and shortages that are being accelerated by the growth of AI and high performance computing. So this particular question is, how do oil and gas companies raise capital for data center development projects? How do oil and gas companies raise capital for data center development projects? That's a great question, because so much of the data center energy ecosystem is actually relatively new to data centers. What I've seen over the past 12 months is I get a lot of people that are reaching out to me that are newbies to data centers, that come from either a real estate background or come from an energy background. And the reason that they're all of a sudden interested in figuring out how they can help the data center ecosystem, how their business can get involved in helping the data center ecosystem, is like everyone else on the planet. They've noticed that over the past 2, 3, 4 years, because of OpenAI and NVIDIA, pretty much every mainstream news media outlet, business media outlet, is constantly talking about data centers and digital infrastructure and critical facilities. Some of them, in the context of grid power availability, are talking about these industries in not so flattering terms, especially in countries where data center power consumption is starting to approach the 10% mark, where data centers are consuming 10% or more of the country's grid availability. So at this point, most people are quite well aware of the explosive growth that's happening in data centers in a very, very different way, in a very different context than it was as recently as like 10 years ago. If you were to talk to your friends and family members that work outside of IT, that work outside of digital infrastructure about what you do for work 10 years ago, what was the likelihood that, for example, in the US, that they'd be talking about data centers on CNN or CNBC or Bloomberg? It happened, but it happened like a couple times a year when the publicly traded REITs would report their quarterly earnings. Companies like Digital Realty, Equinix, QTS, like they would be on these programs and they'd get their moments and they would talk about it. And a couple days later, the coverage would be talking about other tech companies, other non-tech companies. Now we're to the point where, because of what's happened with the growth and interest in the large language models and AI and robotics and EV and smart cities and IoT, it's constantly dominating the news cycles. And as a result, there's, for better or worse, mostly for better, there's a lot more awareness among people outside of digital infrastructure about the nature of these opportunities. And that's a significant part of the reason why real estate professionals who typically may have spent their career in commercial or multifamily or retail or office or something like that, all of a sudden are super interested in industrial development projects that support data centers. Along the same lines, oil and gas companies that in the past may have had mining and drilling and traditional kind of oil and gas kind of projects are all of a sudden super interested in what they can do to support the growth of data centers. I had two gentlemen on the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast a couple of weeks back that come from an oil and gas background, and they're building a business that has turbine power generators that use liquid natural gas. So all of a sudden they can place data centers in areas where there's no utility grid constraints, because they can be completely off grid, where the liquid natural gas is powering the generators and the backup can be traditional diesel. It could be traditional utility power if it's available. But yeah, it can either be a primary or secondary source. Hydrogen fuel cells are another alternative energy source that's getting a lot of attention recently. And there's nuclear small modular reactors are also getting a lot of interest in energy potentially for powering data centers. So oil and gas companies that want to get into data center development projects, how are they going to raise capital? I think a lot of the ways that they would raise capital largely will, there's two different kinds of investors. There's investors that are really good at digital infrastructure and data centers, and they've been at this a while. Like one that comes to mind would be like Digital Bridge. But there's dozens of others who get involved in various degrees of acquiring and building portfolio companies that expand digital infrastructure data centers in the US and globally. And there's certain investment companies that specialize in certain regions of the world, and certain that specialize in certain sizes and certain segments within that. So there's data center, digital infrastructure kind of investors, and US, north of the Americas, Europe, Asia Pacific. They're in every one of these regions, there's data center, digital infrastructure kind of investors. There's also oil and gas investors. Again, oil and gas has been around for decades, for generations. So again, there's a well-defined ecosystem of private equity and venture capital kinds of investors. So it really depends on who you're looking to have control your board seats, where your capital is going to actually come from. But at the end of the day, I take a go-to-market approach with all of this. Is in the same way that you would build a ideal client profile for the perfect clients for what you're going to look to do to build a sales pipeline. It's another, at the end of the day, it's another pipeline. So instead of it being an ideal client profile, it's an ideal investor profile, ideal venture capital, private equity profile of like defining where should these companies be located, how big or small are they, what industries they tend to have expertise in, and then building in the same way you'd build a target account list to power traditional sales and lead gen and go to market. You want to build a list of potential investors. And as I alluded to a few moments ago, I think there's a different target account list and a different set of personas and goals and challenges, regardless of whether you're targeting investors that focus on data centers and digital infrastructure projects. And there's a separate target account list, target investor list, and separate set of personas for oil and gas investors, oil and gas private equity related companies or venture kind of companies that specialize in oil and gas kinds of projects. So when you do that, it's the same like you'd approach any other go-to-market strategy. So you have your list of target investors and you figure out who the stakeholders are in those companies, the limited partners, or whoever else that you're trying to get in front of, what they care most about, and developing outbound, developing a little bit of content, developing perhaps some kind of events that give those folks a reason to start a conversation with you. And the ideal scenario is that you're starting a conversation with them months or at least weeks, ideally months before you're ready for that capital raise. So you can build up the know, like, and trust before you're to the point where there's strong urgency to need that capital. Obviously, just like salespeople that miss the first 83% of the journey, if you show up when your burn rate is completely out of control, and if you don't close around in the next couple of weeks, it's lights out for the company, that's not a good scenario. So what you want to be doing is always building and nurturing these relationships. And it's really just another form of outbound. It's really another form of educating and building trust so you get a chance for the key stakeholders in these investment companies, whether it's venture, whether it's private equity or something a little bit different from that. Maybe it's even research analysts if you're going to like IPO kind of stage. So at that point, you'd be looking to talk to like equity research analysts, fundamental analysts at big brokerage firms or investment banks, right? Who specialize in either digital infrastructure or oil and gas. And they have investor days, right? You have road shows where you go around and your CEO and your CFO and whoever else would be educating and building trust with those kinds of stakeholders. So that's at the end of the day, when you're looking to raise capital, that's how you get the ball running. And then, of course, you need the deep expertise in the finance and the investment side and building data rooms and figuring out the terms and the structure and everything like that. Just way beyond my pay grade of how I would be involved with this. But like at the end of the day, for just like creating attention, what I've seen work well, at least on the software side and on the digital infrastructure side, is this is just another part of your CRM, right? It's another stakeholder in your company is responsible for the capital raise. Depending on your company size, it's probably the CTO, the CEO working with the chief investment officer, chief financial officer. You're keeping track of these potential investors and the stakeholders, investors in your CRM. You're potentially having some outbound messages to get the ball rolling, to get some of these meetings happening. And you're figuring out a way for you to share updates on what you're working on. So you're in front of them over a period of multiple touch points, over a period of multiple months, in the same way that you would educate and build trust with enterprise buyers. These are enterprise buyers, enterprise investors in your company. So figure out what's top of mind for them. Proactively add insights about what's going on at a macro level in your industry for your category that would be of interest to them. And whether it's blogs, whether it's videos, whether it's LinkedIn content, whether it's email, for sure, events, super, super common to have these investor days and have these roadshow kinds of events. So at the end of the day, that by the time they're ready for you to come in and do a pitch, that there's already they already know your founders, there's already know, like, and trust. You've already built up some strong professional branding in the space for why they should pay attention to you in the first place. So that's my general approach, my general advice for how oil and gas companies can raise capital for data center development projects, is figure out who your target investors are that you would love to have as an extension of your company, who you're basically going to be partnering with to provide this capital. Figure out who within these companies on this targeted list, who have the perfect people that would be a great fit for having a board seat with you, and what kind of expertise they bring to what you're doing. And maybe it's a little bit of both. Maybe you're bringing in an investor and a lead investor and a secondary investor that each bring some expertise from oil and gas and some expertise for data center development on the data center real estate side. At the end of the day, those are ultimately your decisions. But in terms of purely like mechanics and strategy and tactics, it's getting clear on who they are at a company level, who they are at an individual level, what they care about, and figuring out a way to get in early and get in often so you can educate and build trust with them long before the pitch meeting, long before you get to the point where you're negotiating the term sheet, negotiating the cap table. So that's the final question that I'm going to be addressing in this week's Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show. So glad that you were able to join us this week. If you have an idea for a topic or a question or a challenge that you think we should address in an upcoming show, make sure to leave that in the comments wherever you are watching. If you want to make sure that you stay in the loop on upcoming educational events and resources just like this, be sure to subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter that comes to your email inbox each Sunday. You can sign up. You can subscribe directly on our website at www.dcsmi.com. If you and I are not currently connected on LinkedIn and you'd like to be, just send me a connect invitation, mention that you were watching or attending the Data Center Go-to-Market Sales and Marketing Q&A show, and I'd be happy to connect with you on LinkedIn to become an extended part of your network. And we look forward to seeing you back again next week when we'll be tackling another handful of the biggest sales and marketing challenges that we're hearing about throughout data centers, digital infrastructure, and critical facilities, and helping you, your team, and your company be able to capitalize on as many of these growth opportunities as possible.
The Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is sponsored by DCSMI, elevating the role of sales, marketing, and go-to-market GTM professionals in the growth of the data center industry. To stay informed about upcoming episodes, make sure that you subscribe to the Data Center Sales and Marketing newsletter on the DCSMI website that can be found at www.dcsmi.com. Again, that URL is www.dcsmi.com.